Well, good morning. Good to see everybody here. So glad you're able to make it today to one of the Sunday morning gatherings of Crossway Church. Before I get going, I want to make a very quick but very important announcement. The elder selection team has taken nominations from our church body, and then they met and they prayed and they wrestled and they discussed and they agonized, and they have selected actually Brandon Lafferty to roll onto the elder body beginning in January. This is a picture of Brandon. Apparently, all I could find was a picture of him after he was mowing the yard. But anyway, so I'm excited about Brandon. I think Brandon is a great guy. He's a godly man. He loves God. He loves his church. He loves his family. He loves people. And he's wise, he's kind, he's generous, and I think he's going to make a great addition to our elder team, and I'm excited about that. Part of the reason why I tell you about that, though, is because 2 weeks from today, as a church family, we are going to vote to confirm the decision that was made by the elder selection team. And you don't want to miss that day. It's just going to be a really, really, really good day. So we are in the fourth week of a sermon series that we are doing entitled How to Neighbor. And the reason why we're doing this sermon series is because Jesus gave us two huge commandments. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And then he gave us another command, and he gave it to us as if the two are connected. As if it's impossible to do the first one if we don't do the second one. So he said, love God with everything. And then he told us, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, a little bit later in that same conversation where Jesus gave us that command, he went on to say, and it's on these two commands that all the law and prophets hang. That's Jesus' way of saying everything in your Bible. The stuff you understand, the stuff you don't understand, the stuff that frustrates you, the stuff you like, the stuff you dislike, the stuff that's easy for you, the stuff that's hard for you. If you were to boil it all down to two things, it's love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so we've been talking about that second part, love your neighbor as yourself. And the reason why we've sort of zeroed in on that is because it seems fairly straightforward, but it actually can be kind of tricky. Sometimes it's hard to know, are we doing it right? Are we doing it wrong? Are we actually doing what Jesus intended for us to do when he said, love your neighbor as yourself? So all throughout this series, each week, we've been talking about a group of people that if Jesus were here today, if he were standing right here in the middle of our presence today, he would either point at these people or he would refer to them and he would say, those are the people I was talking about. Those are the people I was talking about when I said, love your neighbor as yourself. I want you to love them the way that you love yourself. And I got to tell you, the coolest part, or at least one of the coolest parts of this whole series for me, has been watching you guys respond. I mean, it's just been so cool to watch you guys love people, to watch you guys care for people. In week 1, we talked about how to love somebody of a different race. And I watched as many of you decided, I need to do a better job loving people who are from a different race than me. And I just was so proud of you in that moment. And then in the next week, we talked about loving the lonely. And at the end of that service, we challenged everybody to take a kindness challenge. We had some things set up all along the walls in our church, and there were these envelopes, and inside every envelope was a card. There were 6 different cards I think you could have gotten, but each card had 3 different suggestions for just an act of kindness you could do for somebody. And so we challenged you guys. We said, look, would you go get a card, and then this week pick one of those things and do it for somebody else, just somebody who may be struggling with loneliness. And I watched as everybody took a card before they left. There were even some people that left without getting one, forgot, came back, grabbed one, like 20 or 30 minutes after most people had left church. And then for the next week, I kept hearing story after story after story of people who did it, who took the challenge, and they told me about what it did in their heart, and they told me about what it did for the people they did it for. And then I had some people come up and say, well, I couldn't pick one, so I did 2. Or I even had a couple of people go, I couldn't pick one, so I did all 3. There was even someone who watched our services online, and they were watching it from several states over. And they contacted us and they said, we want to take the kindness challenge too. Can we have a kindness card? Can I have one for me? Can I have one for my son? So of course we gave them one, and they went out in their own community and they took the kindness challenge there. And then they called us back and they said, hey, can we have another kindness card? We're like, no, you only get one. I'm just kidding. We sent them another one. But look, I mean, it's just been so neat to see you guys respond. Last week, we talked about the orphans, loving orphans. And at the end of the service, we said, we're going to do this different than we normally do. There's not going to be a song where people try to sneak out while the song's going on. What we're going to do is we're going to ask you to hang around. And we had these different organizations, 7 different organizations that set up displays, and they had representatives here. And we just said, look, would you visit 3 of them before you go? And just ask 3 different questions as you go and you talk to these people. Look, what are they doing? How can I get involved? And God, what do you want me to do? These great organizations that minister to orphans or at-risk kids in our community and in the world. And I watched again as you loved on people. Many of you guys stayed 20, 30 minutes or more after the service, and you waited in really, really long lines just to find out how you could better love people. And man, I am so proud of you guys. And it's been the coolest part of this whole series for me personally. So today I want to talk about one more category of people that are our neighbors that we need to love. And today I want to talk about loving the poor. Specifically, what I want to do is I want to talk about empowering the poor, because I'm not entirely sure we can actually love the poor unless we empower them. Just for kicks and giggles, as I was putting this talk together for this morning, I went to Twitter and I did a search on broke or hashtag broke just to see. Now there's some of you that are going to try to do this during the service. Wait until we're done, okay? But I did this just to see what people would say, what they would talk about. And it was really interesting, the things that people wrote underneath that search, underneath that word. I want to share a couple of them with you. Someone said, I'm so broke, my baloney has no first name. Now, if you're under 40, you don't get that, right? But for those of us about middle age and above, you get that, right? Another person said this, I'm so poor, I can't even get a sugar daddy. All I can afford is a Splenda daddy. Now, if you're a Splenda daddy here today, no offense, okay? Somebody else said this, I'm so poor, I rub cologne from magazines on my shirt, and when they say, oh, you smell so good, what is that? I say, page 5. I think that's an innovator. That's incredible. And then one person said this, I'm so broke, I'd go to KFC to lick other people's fingers after they eat. And that's just gross. That's just gross. Look, if you're broke, don't be broke and gross. Just be broke. You know, all joking aside, there are probably some of you in here that when I said that we're going to be talking about the poor, probably the thought that went through your head was, they're talking about me. No doubt in the very room that we are in, there are some of us that are struggling financially. And if you don't struggle personally financially, I can almost guarantee that you know somebody who is. Maybe it's somebody you work with, maybe it's somebody in your neighborhood, maybe it's somebody you come to church with. But we've all encountered poverty. The reality is there are a whole ton of people in our very backyard that are struggling financially. And maybe some of you haven't encountered poverty that way. Maybe you encountered poverty a little bit differently. Perhaps you went to a third world country. And while you were in a third world country, you went to go see a family, a group of people that live in a home, but you and I would never describe it as a home. It's a structurally unsound building, if you want to call it that. It has corrugated tin on the side, and it's probably 10 by 10. And you discovered perhaps that there are 5, 6, or 7 people living in that little teeny tiny space. They don't actually have a door. They use some sort of a sheet or a blanket to act as a door. When you went inside the home, if you got the opportunity to do it, you probably noticed that there was no running water. Perhaps there was a bucket over to the side where everybody used to use the bathroom. They didn't have a refrigerator like you and I. When we get hungry and we want something to eat, we open it up and it's slap full, and we close it and we say, man, there's just nothing to eat. All they had was a bag of rice or a bag of flour, and they were hoping to make it through the week with that. They also didn't have running water, as I mentioned earlier, so chances are they had to walk a mile or two just to get fresh drinking water and water to cook and bathe. Some of you have encountered poverty like that. Maybe it was on a missions trip or something like that. But the reality is that all poverty is real, isn't it? Doesn't matter what type of poverty you've experienced or you've encountered, all poverty is real, and it's pervasive in this world. In Matthew chapter 25, there's this interesting passage of scripture where Jesus is telling a parable. If you don't know what a parable is, essentially it's a story that Jesus made up. He just makes it up, and he makes it up for the purpose of communicating a truth. And in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is telling a parable to try to help people understand what it will be like when he comes back. And in this story, what he ends up doing is he separates those who are his from those who are not. He calls those who are his sheep, and in the story, he ends up addressing them, and here's what he tells them. He says, man, you know what? I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was a prisoner, and you came and visited me. And the people in Jesus' story are so confused. They don't know where that happened. They don't know how they did that. They don't remember seeing Jesus there. And so they ask him, Jesus, when did we do these things? When did we give you food to eat? When did we give you a cup of cold water? When did we put clothes on your back? When did we visit you? When did we invite you in our home? When did we provide medical aid? And I want you to hear Jesus' response. Here's how he responded. The king, who is actually Jesus in the story, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, and don't miss this, you did for me. In other words, if I understand Jesus right, essentially what he's saying is this: when you and I do good for other people, it's as if we are ministering to and blessing Jesus himself. I mean, that's how special it is. And perhaps it's for that reason why in Proverbs chapter 19 we read this: whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. When we serve other people, we're serving God himself. And as if that weren't enough, there's this shocking passage of scripture in 1 John chapter 3 where John writes this letter to a group of Christians, and I want you to hear what he says. He says, if anyone has material possessions, in other words, if you and I have resources at our disposal, if we have time, if we have talent, if we have influence, if we have money, if we have resources, material things at our disposal, and sees a brother or sister in need. So we see somebody who could use that, who would benefit if we leveraged those resources their direction. So if we see somebody like that, but we have no pity on them, in other words, we just kind of go on with our life as if we didn't see it and we don't have the capacity to do anything about it, then he asks this question: how can the love of God be in that person? So John's saying this: look, if you have the power to meet a need, and you see somebody in need, and you do nothing, you and I might need to ask ourselves a hard question. Do we even love God? Pretty strong stuff, isn't it? Now in the next verse, he goes on, and he says, dear children, let us not love with words or speech. He's almost begging us here. He goes, guys, let's not be the type of people who see a problem and say, you know what, somebody should do something about that. Let's not be the type of people that we see issues in our world and needs in our world and we go, man, the government should do something about that. Let's not be the type of people that when we see things, we say to ourselves internally or we say it out loud, you know, one day if I get the chance, or one day if I'm not so busy, or one day when I have less going on, I'm going to do something about that. Let's not be the type of people, John would say, where we see an issue in the world and we go, you know what we should do? We should pray about that. Now, don't mishear me here. I'm not saying that prayer is bad. It's great. It's a good thing. We all should be doing it. But what John is arguing is, it's not enough. It's not enough to cop out of doing something by merely saying, we'll pray for it or pray about it. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but let's do something. Actions and in truth. So how do we do this? God's been abundantly clear about what he wants us to do. How do we empower the poor? Because the reality is we've all been in a situation where we've had the opportunity to do that, right? All of us have been in situations where we encountered a person or a group of people or maybe an issue or a need in our world, and our heart broke for it. And we long to do something about it. And we found ourselves in this internal wrestling match. Like, what do I do? How do I get it right? I don't want to mess things up. I don't want to hurt in the process of trying to help. And I'm just not sure what to do. So how do we actually do what God has been very clear that we should do? How do we empower the poor? Now, I think in order to answer that question, we have to first answer a different question. Before we know how to empower the poor, we need to understand what poverty is. So what is poverty? A few years ago, I read a book that absolutely changed the way I think about this particular issue in our world. Here's what the book is. It's called When Helping Hurts. And the whole premise behind the book is that sometimes good-hearted people try to help people, but they do it in a way that actually is more hurtful than helpful. So the book is about how we, from a biblical perspective, can empower the poor. Now in this book, and by the way, if you haven't read this book, I want to encourage you to go read it. Pick it up, get it. It's a great book. But in this book, they make some rather interesting statements about poverty. One of them went like this: most Americans define poverty as a lack of something material. If you and I were to ask to describe poverty or define poverty or tell me how you know when poverty exists, what we would probably do is describe it in material terms. We would say, well, it's the lack of housing or adequate housing, or it's the lack of enough income to actually survive. Perhaps we would point out the working poor. Some of us would say, well, I think it's a lack of health care or necessary health care. Some of us might say, well, I think it's when people don't have good drinking water, and we might point to a whole bunch of things. If you're 14 years old, you would say it's when I can't get the new iPhone, right? But we would describe it in terms of a lack of material things. A few years back, there was an organization that went and surveyed 60,000 poor people in the poorest countries in our world. And they asked them, look, would you describe or define poverty for us? And here's what they discovered: that the truly poor define poverty not in lack of material things, but as a mindset. As they asked these people, look, describe poverty to me, tell me about it, what does it look like? Let me tell you how they described it. They used the word shame. They say, look, I just feel constantly ashamed, overwhelming, never ending. It's just a feeling of shame that I absolutely can't shake. They talked about worthless. They just go, man, I just feel like my life is meaningless, like I don't add value, like I feel worthless. They used the word fear over and over and over and over again. They talked about it in terms of humiliation. They said it's humiliating because you feel stuck and you don't have the means. I don't have the education I need, or I don't have the transportation I need, and I'm just humiliated by it. They talked about it in terms of hopeless. It feels like a situation that I can never escape. And they talked about being trapped. It's important for us to understand that poverty isn't merely a lack of material things. It's actually a mindset too. And the reason why that's important is because if we address the material issue without addressing the mindset, all we're doing is putting a Band-Aid on the real issue. Unless we help them deal with the shame, unless we help them deal with the worthlessness, unless we help them deal with the hopelessness, they're going to still live with a mindset that got them into poverty or keeps them in poverty in the first place. We need to help them move to a place of hopefulness where they understand that the God that created them loves them, and He will empower them, and He will help them not just survive and navigate their reality, but they can actually, if they'll tap into God's power, they can thrive. We need to address this. But there's something else I want you to understand about poverty that's so important that we wrap our minds around. And here's what it is. The root of all poverty is brokenness. The root, brokenness is the cause of all poverty. And let me be super clear about this. All of us, every single one of us are broken. We are broken because there's more than one type of poverty. Today we're talking about material poverty. Last week, a couple weeks ago, we talked about relational poverty, something that every one of us struggles with. Don't even get me started on spiritual poverty. All of us experience poverty, and all of us are broken. All of us. But brokenness is the cause of all poverty. It started with brokenness with God in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are bopping along, everything's fine, there's harmony, there's no brokenness, there's perfect relationship with God, there's perfect relationship with themselves, perfect relationship with each other, perfect relationship with all of God's creation, and everything's fine, it's perfect, it's exactly how you and I long for it to be until they sinned, and they broke their relationship with God. And now the scriptures talk about how creation itself groans under the weight of sin and the brokenness that was ushered in that eventually led to poverty of all different kinds. But it didn't just end there. Brokenness with self perpetuates poverty too. There are people who are struggling with poverty of all different kinds who walk around with this low self-esteem. They just feel like they don't measure up, they'll never be good enough, that maybe they were a mistake by God and they just need to give up. They've totally forgotten about the fact that they were created in the image of God and they have infinite value and infinite worth in God's mind and that they are not a mistake. They've forgotten it. And so they walk through this life and they feel ashamed and they have this low self-image and they feel worthless and helpless and they feel like they can't do anything about the world that they find themselves in. And then there's brokenness with each other that perpetuates poverty. There are people struggling with poverty of some sort and they've done everything that they possibly can to resolve it. And every effort has fallen short. And they desperately need help. But they're too ashamed to ask for it. They're worried about what somebody else might think, or what somebody else might say, or how somebody else might feel. And on the other side of the coin, there are people that have the resources they need. But we, by and large, live self-absorbed lives, and there are people with resources who just are mostly focused on their life and what they got going on and their lifestyle that they don't even notice the people around them living in poverty. The cause of poverty is brokenness. And I think that's why it was so powerful and so important when in Luke chapter 4, Jesus walks into the temple. He picks up a scroll from the book of Isaiah. He opens it up, and with everybody standing there, quiet, listening, sitting down, he starts reading from the scroll from the book of Isaiah. Thankfully, Luke records for us the part of Isaiah that Jesus read. I want you to hear it. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim what? Good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now imagine Jesus reads a little bit more, rolls the scroll up, waits till everybody's there and everybody's listening. Every eye is on him, men, women, children, young and old, staring at him, hanging on his every word. And a couple of verses later, Jesus looks at him and says, today, the prophecy that I just read is being fulfilled in your midst. What Jesus is saying is he's saying, look, all the brokenness, all the poverty, all the shackles, all the prisoners, I am their answer. I'm it. And we need to understand that it's Jesus who saves. It's Jesus who heals the brokenhearted and the brokenness. It is Jesus who sets people free. It's Jesus. You see, when we understand those things about poverty, when we understand that look, poverty isn't merely a lack of material possessions, but it's at the core of it, it's a mindset. And when we understand that poverty is the result of brokenness, but Jesus is the answer to the brokenness, it shapes how we empower the poor. So what do you and I do? What do we do? How do we do it? What do we do when later on this week as we're driving down the road and we get stopped at a stoplight, there's a guy over the side asking for money? What do we do when possibly for some of us later on this week, somebody we know gets the news that they've been laid off or fired? What do we do when later on this week maybe we get a friend or loved one gets the call that they have stage 4 cancer? Well, let me give you 3 quick ideas about how we can effectively empower the poor. And I'm not going to be able to fully unpack these things with you. I just want to briefly mention them. Number 1, we are called, and by the way, we're called. God's been really clear about this. We are called to serve others, not save others. It's important that we get that. It is insulting and dangerous. It is wildly insulting and dangerous to think that we are someone's answer. Jesus is the one that saves. We serve. Jesus is the power. We are merely the conduit to his power, to him. Jesus saves. He's the Savior. We are the servants. We serve. So how do we serve? How do we serve, and how do we best serve is maybe a better way of saying it. How do we best serve to empower the poor? Well, it comes down to 2 things: relief and restoration. They're different, but they're equally important. If we do one without the other, we're in trouble. So let me kind of define it for you. Relief is immediate temporary help during and after a crisis. It's the type of aid that we provide when when tornadoes rip through our city. It's what we do when our city doesn't have running water for 3 or 4 or 5 days. It's the aid that we provide when someone loses a job. It's the aid that we provide when somebody finds out they have stage 4 cancer. It's what we do in that moment. We need to provide relief. But we also need to provide restoration. Restoration is long-term relationships to rebuild wholeness. This is what we do after the attention has waned. Somebody has something bad in their life, a crisis happens, and rightfully so, people rush to that person and rush to that situation. But give it a week or two and that stuff wanes. Because people get distracted, or maybe the news wants to find something more interesting, or there's some other thing they want to cover. This is where we work with the person long term to rebuild wholeness. When you think about it, this is exactly what the Good Samaritan did with the Jewish man on the side of the road. He walks up, he sees the man bleeding, half dying, he's there, he needs help. So what does he do? He walks up and he pours oil and wine on his wounds, and he bandages the wounds. That's relief. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't just provide relief. He loads the man on his donkey. He rides him down to an inn. He checks him into the thing. He pays for the care he needs in his night stay. And he tells the innkeeper, look, here's the deal. I'm going to come back. He's probably going to have ongoing needs. When he comes back, I'll cover that too. That's restoration. Relief and restoration. This is how we serve. This is how we serve to empower the poor. Here's how this fleshes out in my life. My wife and I give outside of our church. The bulk of our giving goes to our church. But outside of our church, there are two organizations that my wife and I give to. We give to the Center for Pregnancy Choices, and we give to Compassion International. And amongst other reasons, part of why I like giving to those organizations, part of why it's important for me and it's important for Stacy, is because they engage in both relief and restoration. You see, I believe serving the poor means that when I leverage my resources, I'm getting the biggest bang for my buck. I'm being as strategic as I possibly can be. And so for my wife and I going forward, we're only going to support organizations that do that, because I think that's how we best serve the poor. I'm not suggesting you do what I do, but I think that you should at least consider that. Don't be reactive in your giving, be proactive. Find a way to best serve and empower the poor. But there's something else you need to know. We are called to relate with people, not rescue people. I want you to hear this next statement because it's really important. Those who are struggling are not projects you help. They are people you love. Those who are struggling are not projects that we help. They are people that we're called to love. At some point in time, every single one of us in this room will find ourselves in a space where we need help. Every one of us. And you know what we don't want in that moment? We don't want to be somebody's project. None of us do. We don't want to be the person where they give money or they give you something so that they can go away and feel good about themselves. We want to be loved. People aren't projects. They're people that we love. And so if we're going to do this right, here's what it means. It means that when we find somebody in need who's struggling with some type of poverty, that means we come down and we sit down and we get to know them and we try to understand them and we try to understand their story and we ask questions and we find ways to try to come alongside of them rather than rescue them. And along the way, as we try to help them towards wholeness again, it means that we don't do anything for them that they can do for themselves. For some of you who are parents, you should probably do the same thing for your kids. Don't do anything for your kids that they can't do for themselves. Because here's what happens when we do this for people who are trying to help. When we do things for them that they can do for themselves, what we end up doing is we end up hurting them, because what we do is we perpetuate that cycle and that mindset of ashamed and humiliated and hopeless. See, people don't need to become dependent upon us. They need to be able to become independent. And so don't do things for them that they can't do for themselves. Because look, they're not projects. They're people that you love. Which brings me to the last thing I want to point out if we're going to do this right. We're called to reach out, not down. We're called to reach out because we care. We're called to reach out because we are also broken. We're called to reach out because we also need help. You see, we're no better than the people that we are trying to help. So we reach out, not down. Brene Brown said this. She said, "We've divided the world into those who need help and those who offer help. The truth is, we are both. We're both people who need help, and we're people who offer help too." So if we're going to serve and if we're going to empower the poor, it means that we do it with a sense of humility. Understanding that we're just trying to be a conduit because we need help too. And we're broken too. So here's what I'd like us to do as a church family. I would like us to actually do this together. I don't want us to be the type of church family that we come together and we do exactly what John was warning people about, where we talk a lot and we make it sound good and it's interesting and we go, yeah, we should do that, and we do absolutely nothing about it. We cannot be that church family. We have to be more. And so I would like us to do this together, and here's how I would like us to do this. Next Sunday is Serve Sunday. If you've been around Crossway for any decent amount of time, you already know what that means. If you're new, let me tell you what's going to happen. We're going to have one service at 10 o'clock next week. It's going to be a shortened service, and then afterwards, we have these projects that we have lined up. In fact, we have 20-something, I want to say 25 or 26 different projects that have been identified by groups of people or people in our community that would like for us to come alongside of them and help empower them. Here's what I would like us to do. And man, here's what I want to see this time. I want to see what I've seen the last few weeks where we've all gone, you know what? If this is what Jesus has told us to do, let's do it. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to sign up for a Serve project for next week. And then show up. And let's empower the poor. There are all kinds of projects all over the place. Some of them are hard, some of them are easy, some are in between. Some are for families, some of them aren't, all that stuff. My wife at the end of the service is going to come out and give you more information about how you can get involved. But look, let's do something. Let's do something. Let's empower the poor. Sign up, show up, and go with us next week. And together, let's love our neighbor as we love ourselves.